Alright guys, welcome back to the channel, it's Matty here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the best decks in Pokémon TCG Pocket while analyzing all of their win rates in matchups against the other top decks in the format. I think it's going to be really interesting. I think we're going to uncover some really useful information in this video, so stick around, don't forget to hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe. Let's get right into it. Alright, and first and foremost, let's take a look at Mewtwo EX. So, the deck lists that people are running for Mewtwo and Gardevoir EX is very much sort of the same across the board. There's not much variety in the way that people are playing Mewtwo and Mew EX. Now, some decks aren't even playing Mew EX, they're actually using the Jinx card from Genetic Apex, that is, which does more damage depending on, how much energy is attached to our opponent's active Pokemon. This is actually a pretty decent card right now in the metagame. In fact, two of the top last two first place finishes that Mewtwo got were running Jinx instead of Mew EX. So I think it's really matchup dependent. I think in the format right now with Celebis and all of the Gyarados and Misty decks that are kind of starting to rise up to prominence, Gyarados especially, it makes a lot of sense to run Jinx. I think it's a really good backup attacker for only 2 energies, where Mew EX does cost 3 energies, can be a little bit more hard to get out. It also has the potential to do a little bit more damage in those matchups. So I think it's actually really good. I think Celebi's actually on the rise as well, so I would say that Jinx is looking to be perhaps the best partner to pair with Mewtwo and Gardevoir in a lot of these decks. We've seen it do really well recently. Some decks are also running the Siglith card from Mythical Island, which can be good, gives the deck a little bit more front-loaded consistency. However, it doesn't have a lot of HP, so it can get knocked out pretty early in the game if you're going against some faster-paced decks. All right, now let's take a look at the matchup data and the win rate percentages for Mewtwo and Mew EX. If you guys were wondering, I wanted to make this video mainly because it's been about 2 or 3 weeks since Mythical Island came out, and we actually have a really large sample size right now, at least for the most played decks, to determine sort of what their best and worst matchups are. The sample size here is thousands and thousands of matches, so very large sample size. We should have a great understanding of what these decks are good against and what they're not good against. So for Mewtwo and Mew EX, here are all of the best, strongest matchups against the other most popular decks in the format. So the first thing that we're going to see here is against Pikachu and Substrika. We actually have a 54% win rate. I wouldn't say this is phenomenal, but it is sort of a positive win rate, right? And there's been a lot of matches, 1,300 matches played against Pikachu and Substrika. And I think the reason for this is that Substrika just doesn't provide that much value against Mewtwo and Mew EX. There's not a lot of things. Yes, technically you could snipe a Ralts, but the thing is Mewtwo is so much faster now that sort of the faster paced version of Pikachu being Substrika doesn't necessarily give you that much value in that particular matchup. I don't think Substrika is that useful. I think Zapdos can be useful. Some decks with Substrika run Zapdos, some don't. I think Dedenne can be pretty good, but I think the fact is that Pikachu typically had a pretty good advantage against Mewtwo because it was faster pace. Mewtwo was always sort of a mid to late game setup deck. However, now with Mythical Slab, Mewtwo is just that much quicker, which makes this matchup a little bit less good for Pikachu, and with Substrika we don't have a lot of damage output potential. Substrika is really good in certain scenarios, we'll see here, but against Pikachu, Pikachu and Substrika against Mewtwo rather, is certainly not a great matchup for Pikachu, so a 54% win rate there. We actually see a 57 or a 58% win rate against Celebi EX, which is actually really interesting. I think the reason for this, again, is that Mewtwo can one-hit KO basically everything in Celebi, barring Executor, but a lot of Celebi decks still aren't necessarily focused around Executor. They're kind of front-loading with other Pokemon, which I would highly recommend against. But yeah, I think Mewtwo, with its faster pace, with more HP, the potential to one-hit KO Celebi for 4 energies, which you can do on turn 3 or turn 4 very consistently with Mewtwo. It kind of just makes a lot of sense that this matchup isn't great for Celebi, especially since Celebi's damage isn't guaranteed. I mean, you do need to flip 3 heads instead of just 2 to get the KO on Mewtwo, which, again, isn't always something that Celebi is able to do. Superior doesn't always come out as early as you would like to, but overall, both of the decks are very similar, but I think this tells a lot, basically, when you look at Celebi and Mewtwo, because they're both very comparable decks. They both attack with Stage 1, or Basic rather, EX Pokemon. They both do a lot of damage, and they both require a Stage 2 non-EX Pokemon to get set up to really bolster the deck. But yeah, very interesting. I thought that Mewtwo had a pretty good win rate against Celebi at 57%. Another great win rate is if we go down to actually Charizard EX and all of the Moltres decks. We're looking at a 61% win rate against Charizard and Moltres, which is really interesting. In fact, I would have thought that Charizard had a good, or a better matchup rather, against Mewtwo, but the thing is, a lot of Mewtwo's are still running Mew, and that's sort of the reason why they run Mew EX, right, is against that Charizard matchup. We kind of assumed that Charizard would get pushed out of the metagame a little bit with Mew EX, but it kind of seems that Mew decks or decks that use Mew EX aren't necessarily as popular as we kind of thought. We've actually seen Charizard do really well in the metagame. It does really well against a lot of different decks. It's a really good high roller deck. If you get lucky, Charizard's just going to sweep through whatever you're going against, to be honest with you. But Mewtwo is a little bit too fast-paced for Charizard, and unfortunately, Mew EX is a great counter. So yeah, we actually see a really good win rate against Charizard as well. And now if we look at the fighting aggro decks that are becoming exceedingly popular to counter things like Gyarados, they also have a good Pikachu matchup, but against Mewtwo, not great. Mewtwo actually wins these matchups 70% of the time on average, which is really strong if you think about it. The sample size here is a little bit less. We're looking at about 400 matches, but in those 400 matches, a 70% win rate is absolutely crazy. There's a bunch of reasons for that. You know, we're hitting for weakness, and a lot of our Pokemon have a lot of HP. And the other thing with this matchup is Gardevoir can be used as an attacker, and so can Mew EX, doing, I think, 40 damage to a fighting type Pokemon that's weak to Psychic for only 1 energy can be really strong. So it gives you actually sort of an aggro attacker in a scenario where against an aggro deck that is otherwise weak to you for sure. Aerodactyl's, again, not that great. It's getting 1-hit KO'd by Mewtwo. So for all of the sort of aggro, Primeape, Farfetch'd, Hitmonlee, Aerodactyl decks, you know, I'm just going to call them aggro fighting. We're going to average them all out. But yeah, Mewtwo has a 70% win rate against those decks. So very interesting indeed. It seems that Mewtwo will probably have the most balanced of the win rates, or at least among the most balanced win rates in this video, but I just thought that was really interesting. So let's take a look at the not great matchups that Mewtwo goes up against in this current format. All right, so the glaring weakness for Mewtwo right now is going to be against Gyarados and Greninja. Mewtwo only wins these matches on average 32% of the time, and this is the second most popular matchup for Mewtwo. We have almost 1,800 matches already in Mythical Island, and yeah, 32% win rate is not great. There's, again, a lot of reasons for this. I think that Gyarados' pace is really underrated. Mewtwo is a bit of a faster deck, but so is Gyarados. With the inclusion of Greninja and that 20 damage that Greninja's doing, plus the 140 from Gyarados, that is enough to KO a Mewtwo EX. Along with Druddigon, a lot of times Mewtwo is kind of forced to attack at least one Druddigon, because by the time your Mewtwo gets set up, your opponent probably has found at least one, probably two, both of their Druddigons, which means Sabrina's not really useful to you. You're going to have to just hit through a Druddigon, and if you do, that Gyarados is primed and ready to KO your Mewtwo back on the next turn. So it's really not a great matchup against Mewtwo for sure. I think that Gyarados really struggles against specific matchups, but against things like Mewtwo, it really does provide just a really strong, powerful win rate. So 32% win rate for Mewtwo against Gyarados is quite bad, definitely. And then, of course, Scolipede. This is a really bad matchup for Mewtwo. It kind of is a deck that's specifically made to counter Mewtwo. That's why I kind of thought Scolipede and Weezing would be a little bit more popular in this format, but unfortunately, people just decided not to necessarily counterplay Mewtwo and decided to counterplay things like Gyarados EX or Celebi, which is why Scolipede really dropped in play. The other reason for that is it doesn't have as great of a matchup spread across the board, but Mewtwo is only beating Scolipede 31% of the time, so a very good matchup for Scolipede, very bad matchup for Mewtwo. But the thing is, Scolipede is declining in play, so that's not necessarily that big of an issue. And then the other worst matchup for Mewtwo, rather, is going to be the Greninja and Mew EX deck, kind of the Bullfrog archetype. The reason for this, again, is just Mew EX. It's a really consistent attacker. It allows you to one-hit KO Mewtwo EX for only 3 energies, where Mewtwo needs 4 energies, so again, you kind of have that advantage. Also, Greninja, you can also play sort of the fighting package in this deck as well. Tauros does 120. So it's a deck that's just kind of specifically really good against Mewtwo for a variety of reasons. Mewtwo is only winning this matchup 37% of the time, so it's definitely not great for Mewtwo. But, you know, across the board, all of the matchups that we didn't list here, Mewtwo rather has basically at least a 50-50 matchup, or at least above 50-50. So the matchup spread for Mewtwo is actually crazy. We've seen that it's pretty bad against pretty specific decks. Gyarados is a glaring weakness for Mewtwo, but against basically everything else in the format right now, Mewtwo is exceptionally strong. So I think that's why Mewtwo right now is still at the top of the metagame. There is counterplay to Mewtwo. We've seen it with Scolipede, but unfortunately people necessarily aren't choosing to counter Mewtwo, and I think for that reason, it's going to just float at the top of the metagame right now. All right, and next up, let's take a look at the second most popular deck, which is, of course, Gyarados and Greninja. So there are a lot of different ways to play Gyarados and Greninja. People have decided not to play it with Druddigon. People have decided to not play it with Greninja. Some people even play it with Starmie, but for the most part, I think people understand that the best way to play Gyarados is with Druddigon and Greninja combined. It makes the deck just really versatile in the mid to early game. Druddigon is really great in the active spot. Greninja is a really great backup attacker. It helps fix the math, and that's really where that Greninja and Druddigon package comes in handy. Gyarados is just such a strong Pokemon. 180 HP on a stage 1 Pokemon is, in fact, really crazy. Now, the thing with Gyarados is, though, it is a really strong deck. It has a very volatile matchup spread. So the decks that aren't, or the decks rather that are very good against Gyarados, the matchups that Gyarados struggles with, are as follows. So against Pikachu and Zebstrika, Gyarados is only winning 26% of the time. I mean, this is really a bad matchup for Gyarados. The likelihood of you winning against a Pikachu and Zebstrika is extremely low. Again, a lot of reasons for that. I think the Pikachu Zebstrika deck is specifically beat really to counter things like Gyarados. Yes, it's electro type, so you're hitting for weakness, but we have Zebstrika, which is a very fast-paced card, but allows us to take a KO on a Magikarp on the bench. We also run things like Dedenne or even Zapdos, which again have one-hit KO potential on our opposing Gyarados. Mewtwo with, or rather Pikachu with Giovanni does have the ability to one-hit KO a Dredagon, but the thing is with Zebstrika is you can actually just hit around the Dredagon. So we see these types of cards, Zebstrika with Hitmonlee as well. Those two cards are really good against Gyarados because you can attack around Dredagon, which is good to avoid that chip damage, and most of the time Gyarados isn't committing any energies to Dredagon, so you know you don't really have to necessarily worry about attacking it if you don't have to. And also, you know, we have the ability to one-hit KO a Magikarp on the bench, and we're both really fast-paced decks. So, yeah, Pikachu Zebstrika, a really, really bad matchup for Gyarados, 26%. And then Pikachu and Raichu is also not that great at 36%. So, we are sacrificing about a 10% win rate if you're playing Raichu instead of Zebstrika against Gyarados, but 36% is still really strong. The thing with Pikachu and Raichu is it actually has a better matchup spread across the board, but you are sacrificing those 10 points against Gyarados. But yeah, it's just Pikachu, it's still pretty fast-paced. Raichu actually hitting for 160 against Gyarados does matter. There are actually quite a few scenarios where you can one-hit KO a Gyarados or KO a Gyarados. Maybe you just go in with a Dedenne and you attack for, you know, just sort of one energy. You do 20 damage and you get that paralysis, then you could go into your Raichu and kind of sweep up. So I think just Pikachu in general is a really strong card in that matchup. We also are running the new Electabuzz, which does give us a bench sniping option, an option to attack around Dredagon as well. So it does make Pikachu and Raichu a little bit more flexible. 36% against Pikachu and Raichu. Again, still very, very bad. And then if we go down here, we see against these Aerodactyl, Primeape, aggro fighting decks, really the decks that just include Hitmonlee that are fast-paced. Also a 30% win rate for Gyarados in these matchups, which is, again, really bad. So I think that the Pikachu decks are a great counter to Gyarados, as are the fighting aggro decks, which are both becoming probably as much played as any other deck in the format right now. I think Gyarados and Mewtwo are going to be at the top, but below them, it really is looking like Pikachu with Celebi and the aggro fighting decks with Aerodactyl are becoming the next most popular deck. So these are on the rise, Pikachu's on the rise, and again, all pretty bad matchups for Gyarados, which is definitely really interesting. So Gyarados is an extremely strong deck, but there are really hard counters to it in the form of Pikachu and these aggro Hitmonlee fighting type decks, which is really interesting for sure. And then if we look at the upside matchups for Gyarados, this is where it kind of all makes sense. And this is an interesting thing to note here. Gyarados has a 67 or 68% win rate against Mewtwo and Gardevoir. Mewtwo is the most played deck right now, aside from the Pikachu variants, so having a really strong matchup against Mewtwo is a good reason to play Gyarados. I think it's a big reason why Gyarados is so strong. And then if we look at the Celebi matchup, we actually see a 64% win rate. So against Mewtwo and Celebi, very, very good. Again, Celebi and Mewtwo are very similar, so it kind of makes sense that that would be the case. But yeah, interestingly enough, Gyarados counters sort of the two other strongest decks, being Mewtwo and Celebi. And then if we look here into Scolipede, we have a 72% win rate. So we are absolutely walling Scolipedes, no issue there. Nothing to really struggle against, nothing to worry against. And then against Charizard or Arcanine, yeah, let's just take a look at the Charizard one. We have a 55% win rate against Charizard in Moltres. And then we have a 75% win rate against Arcanine in Moltres. So against the Fire decks, we do have the advantage. Being able to one-hit KO is pretty important there. Again, the pacing and the high amount of HP is certainly interesting. You would think that the matchup against Charizard maybe would be in favor of Charizard, just because Charizard has the potential to KO Gyarados. But the thing is, Gyarados, the pace of Gyarados is very underestimated. It's just an extremely fast-paced deck with Misties and only being a Stage 1 Pokemon. So it does kind of make sense. Greninja and Druddigon do fix the math a lot of times, KOing Charizard. So yeah, interesting that the matchup against Charizard just ends up not being that great for Charizard. Gyarados is still strong against a deck that maybe you would hope to have a better matchup for sure against Gyarados. All right, and third, let's take a look at the Celebi decks. Now, there's a lot of different ways to play Celebi. You can categorize it in so many different areas. I think that the main way that people play Celebi is with Superior. However, what we're seeing now is an increase in people also playing Executor EX with Celebi. And in my honest opinion, I believe that playing Executor with Celebi is a much better option. I think that it makes the deck that much better in the current metagame, and we'll kind of see why in a little bit. But Celebi with Executor is what we're going to take a look at here. which basically, I think, in my opinion, is the best way to play Celebi. It includes both Exeggutor and Superior, but we see a 51% win rate against Mewtwo EX, which is pretty decent. It's pretty 50-50, but amongst sort of the standard Celebi archetype, we have a better matchup playing against Mewtwo for playing the Exeggutor package along with it. We see a 37% win rate against Gyarados, so again, that matchup is still not good for us. And the reason for that is that Exeggutor isn't super useful when facing down a Druddigon and a Greninja and a Gyarados. You're probably still going to get KO'd anyway, so it's just not a great matchup no matter which way you slice it. We're kind of just not really in a great position to defeat Gyarados, so I just thought that was interesting. But against Pikachu and Substrika, we have a 67.54% win rate, or a 68% win rate rather. I don't know why I said the full decimal. So a very good win rate against Pikachu, and then a 66% win rate against Pikachu and Raichu. So against Pikachu deck, Celebi with Exeggutor is actually really strong. Pikachu is on the rise. It's going to be sort of the second or third most played deck, I think, in the format right now, especially if you're combining both Substrika and Raichu. So putting us at a really high win rate, I think, is definitely really important to note. And then if we look at the aggro fighting deck, Celebi with Exeggutor actually has a 68% win rate against Aerodactyl, Primeape, and the other fighting type decks, which again is a really great matchup. So if you look at the way that the meta is going, sort of the counter meta to Gyarados, where things like Pikachu and the aggro fighting decks are kind of being on the rise, they're seeing a lot more play to counter things like Gyarados. Celebi has a really good matchup against those decks, as well as having a decent matchup, a 50-50 matchup against Mewtwo and Gardevoir. So this is my opinion. We'll take a look at the tier list as the days roll on. Once we get to Monday and we do or Tuesday rather, we do tier list Tuesday. We'll take a look and we'll see sort of where I rank Celebi and Exeggutor right now, but it's certainly on the rise. It's kind of appearing to be one of the best decks to play in the format right now. But yeah, really strong matchups against Pikachu and the aggro fighting decks. And then if you look at Charizard and Arcanine, very, very bad win rates. But the thing is here that Arcanine and Charizard are decks that people aren't necessarily playing very commonly. They're still not sort of favored amongst the other top decks in the format. They're really outside that top 5, top 10 range. But yeah, the win rates against Charizard EX is 27%, really bad, and then against Arcanine it's 28%. So very not consistent win rates against the fire type decks. That's sort of to be expected. Just in general, not great options for you. The other thing with Celebi and Exeggutor is that we actually have a winning win rate, a 52% win rate against Celebi without Exeggutor. So if you were kind of wondering whether or not you should be playing Exeggutor with Celebi, hopefully this answers your questions. It's still not as played as Celebi EX in Superior without Exeggutor, which I think is really interesting, but having a better win rate basically across the board is certainly a very interesting thing to note. Basically, the way that the format's wrapping up right now is Celebi has a hard matchup against Gyarados and the Charizard Arcanine Fire type decks, but other than that, it's actually really well positioned across the entire metagame, which is really strong. So I would expect Exeggutor and Celebi to be on the rise. It may even appear as an S tier deck in this upcoming week's tier list. Okay, next up, let's take a look at Pikachu and Substrika. This is a really interesting one. This is by far the most played version of Pikachu right now, but I still find that to be a very interesting scenario and a very interesting reason as to why it is the most played version of Pikachu. So let's take a look at some of its struggling matchups, which, spoiler, are a lot. Pikachu and Substrika doesn't have that great of a matchup spread across the metagame. However, we'll see that it is really strong in specific matchups. But against Mewtwo and Gardevoir EX, only a 45% win rate, so not terrible, but definitely not great against Mewtwo. Again, we talked about it earlier in the Mewtwo segment of this video, but the fast-paced nature of Pikachu and Substrika just isn't really an advantage anymore against Mewtwo and Gardevoir, since Mewtwo and Gardevoir is also a very fast-paced deck. We have a 73% win rate against Gyarados and Greninja. Very good matchup against Gyarados and Greninja. This is probably the main reason why people are playing Pikachu, is to counter Gyarados, which a lot of people are considering to be the strongest deck in the format right now. So it makes sense why people would play Pikachu and Substrika, but as we see, after the Gyarados and Greninja matchup, which is kind of the only positive matchup for Pikachu and Substrika, we see a negative win rate against Celebi and Superior at 44%, and then we see a 48% win rate against Pikachu and Raichu, which again is the other way to play Pikachu, and you actually have more of a losing matchup against that version, and not a great matchup against Pikachu and Superior. And we actually have a 31% win rate against Exeggutor with Celebi. So again, very, very much of a struggle in those Celebi matchups. We do have a 63% matchup against Scolipede and Weezing, but again, the decline of Scolipede and Weezing in this format is pretty prevalent. Not a lot of people are choosing to play it. The reason for that is just not great in any other matchups other than Mewtwo, but it doesn't necessarily matter if we have a good win rate, a 63% win rate against Scolipede and Weezing, because it's just not something that a lot of people are playing. And then if we go to the Aerodactyl and Primeape decks, the aggro fighting decks, we only have a 32% win rate against these matchups, which is, again, is on the rise. There's a lot of fighting type decks, a lot of aggro Aerodactyl decks. So again, having a bad matchup against these decks is certainly not great. And then if we look at our Charizard matchup, we see a 58% win rate, which is really the only other upside to Pikachu Zebstrika. The pace and hitting for weakness on that Moltres is really good. The ability to do damage to a benched Charmander, that is, rather, I forgot the name of it, but is certainly pretty good at that matchup. So we have a good matchup against Charizard and Moltres, but we have a 39% win rate against Arcanine and Moltres. So Charizard, pretty decent, but Arcanine, pretty bad, and that's really it. I mean, amongst the other top decks in the format, there isn't really anything worth mentioning that Pikachu and Zebstrika is good against. So it's interesting to me that people are choosing to play Pikachu and Zebstrika over Raichu. It is certainly more played than Pikachu and Raichu, but overall, its matchup spread across the format is pretty terrible, but it is interesting because it does have a really good matchup against Gyarados, which people are putting certainly a lot of value in, at least right now. Okay, and the last deck that I wanted to take a look at in this video is going to be Aerodactyl EX with Primeape or any of the aggro fighting type archetypes that also incorporate Hitmonlee and Marshadow, just sort of the fighting aggro toolbox deck. This is becoming increasingly more and more popular. It actually has a really good overall win rate in the format right now, but let's take a look at the matchups and see just exactly why this deck is doing strongly. So against Mewtwo and Gardevoir, very, very poor win rate for this deck at only 30%, and this is the most played deck in the format, Mewtwo and Gardevoir. So, you know, if we have a really poor win rate against Mewtwo, maybe, you know, necessarily why are we playing these aggro fighting type decks? Well, the reason for that, and the reason why this deck ended up being so good, is because we have a really great matchup spread against Gyarados at 69%. Hitmonlee, the ability to dodge Druddigon, we've already talked about it earlier in the video. So really great win rates for this deck against Gyarados, which is the strongest, probably the second strongest deck in the format, the second most played deck in the format. And then against both the Pikachu decks that people are also playing a lot of to counter Gyarados, we have great win rates. So it's an interesting cycle where Gyarados, probably the strongest deck in the format, Pikachu and the aggro fighting decks are kind of on the rise to counter Gyarados, but the thing is that fighting has a good matchup against Gyarados and Pikachu, whereas Gyarados struggles against fighting. So it actually makes a little bit more sense from a counter meta play to play these aggro fighting type decks, as we see a 66% win rate against Pikachu and Zebstrika and a 73% or 74% win rate rather against Pikachu and Raichu for this aggro fighting deck, which is certainly really strong. But the thing is that these aggro decks actually struggle against Celebi. We see a 47% win rate against Celebi and Superior, but against Celebi and Executor, we only have a 30% win rate. So again, I think that's probably why it makes the most sense for us right now to play the Celebi and Executor package, mainly because we have such a better matchup against all of these aggro Aerodactyl fighting type decks that are on the rise basically to counter Gyarados. So if we're playing Celebi right now, I've said it before in this video, but if you're playing Celebi right now, definitely play it with Executor EX. The jury is still out whether we should still be playing Superior. It does add some power to the late game, but makes the deck a little bit more inconsistent. But either way, definitely really interesting. And the thing that I wanted to take a look at that I thought was really interesting was our matchups against Charizard EX in this format. And as we can see here, we have a 60% win rate against Charizard and Moltres and a 56% win rate against Charizard and Arcanine. So actually really good matchups against the Charizard Moltres decks, which is not something that I necessarily imagined. However, if we go down and we take a look at the other tempo decks in the format, we see that against Arcanine and Moltres, we only have a 44% win rate, which is not a great matchups for us really at all. And then we only have a 42% win rate against aggro fighting decks, basically Aerodactyl and Farfetch'd, fighting decks that don't play Primeape, which I thought was certainly an interesting thing to mention for sure. And then Executor and Mew-EX, so basically the Executor deck that's not running Superior in the format right now, which isn't very commonly played. We have a 27% win rate, so a very bad win rate across the board for fighting. So it does feel like the aggro fighting decks are kind of the best counter meta choice right now for us in this current metagame. But what we're probably going to see is that if this deck continues to be on the rise, if Pikachu's continue to be on the rise, Executor EX with Celebi is actually looking to be probably an S tier choice in this current metagame, which is really, really interesting. But either way, we're going to break it all down in Meta Monday and then further break it down in Tier List Tuesday as we kind of come up on this next week and this next tournament that we're going to see this weekend, the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly. So I'm really excited for that. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I know it was a little bit long. We talked a lot of numbers, a lot of statistics, but hopefully this gave you a good understanding of sort of where these decks are, where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are. If there's any decks that we didn't cover in this video, it's mainly just because they didn't see enough play over the last couple weeks, so we don't have a large enough sample size to quantify the data that we have basically to show this. And if you want to kind of see for yourself or go check out the website, link will be down in the description below for the Play.Limitless TCG website. This is kind of where we do all of our meta calculation and our data analytic, analysis. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I've been Maddie. Don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe. Stay tuned. We're uploading Pokemon TCG Pocket videos all the time. We're on the road to 10,000 subscribers. So the support has been phenomenal. So if you're not subscribed to the channel, I would highly recommend it. I would really appreciate it. But anyway, guys, have a good one. We'll see you next time. Peace out.